La emisión está comenzando. Todos los asistentes están en modo de solo escucha.
Hello, my name's Paul Ryan. I'm from the Australian Resilience Centre and I'm going to be presenting this webinar series, the pre-recorded one. My colleague Alison Quinlan will be presenting and facilitating the discussion that occurs after this that you'll have tomorrow. So just quickly, a little bit of background about myself, and then we'll talk about the structure of the session and a quick overview of what we're going to work through. And as I said, there'll be a discussion session with Alison tomorrow after this pre-recorded session. Just background to myself. So I'm a resilience practitioner based in Australia. I've spent the last 15 years working on resilience assessment and doing lots of resilience assessments with people predominantly in Australia, working on in agricultural regions and in the with Aboriginal communities in the north and in central Australia, as well as with farming communities in the south, and then increasingly over the last few years working with people in developing contexts in Africa and Southeast Asia. As I said, I'll be presenting this short overview of resilience assessment, and we'll look at the conceptual framing. So how do we think about resilience assessment? How do we think about setting it up? I'll talk a little bit of a broader overview about resilience assessment, and then I'll delve into some of the phases of resilience assessment in more detail. And as I said, Alison Quinlan from the Resilience Alliance will facilitate the discussion that occurs after this pre-recording that you have tomorrow. Okay, so framing. For a start, it's really important to understand that the way that we think about resilience assessment is that it's focused on social ecological systems, and that's a concept that means that people and place are tightly enmeshed. They're tightly connected. That they co-evolve so that people influence place and place influences people. And it's subject, because it's such a tightly interlinked system and such a complex system, it behaves like a complex adaptive system. It is a complex adaptive system. And that means it's subject to non-linear dynamics, so changes, unexpected changes because of interactions, because of the connections between different variables in the system and the way they behave, and the presence of thresholds or tipping points. Non-linear systems can behave in unexpected ways, and there can be unintended consequences from intervening in those. And so we need to be cognizant of that when we're doing and thinking about resilience assessment. And they're also subject to fast and slow dynamics, and often it's the fast dynamics that get the attention, but it's the slow dynamics that have all the power. And a resilience assessment approach is really about discovering those fast and slow dynamics and making sure we target the right things. So here's a simple diagram of a social ecological system, and you can see in red there on the left the social subsystem, and that includes people and the economic system, as well as things like infrastructure and technology and the governance of the system. And then on the right-hand side, it's the ecological components of the system: land, water and biodiversity, and all the functions and processes that sustain those. And so there's this constant interaction and evolution between those two things as ecosystems provide goods and services, and then we use those resources in different ways to generate benefits in human well-being, and those two things co-evolve over time. And of course, it's subject to external drivers and internal drivers, as well as shocks and unexpected events that aren't listed there. So this is an important cornerstone of any resilience approach, and it dictates and determines how we think about resilience assessment. So social ecological systems framing is incredibly important. It's also important to recognise that social ecological systems are multi-scale. That is, they have scales above and below. And so if we look at this diagram, we might be interested in the interaction between plants and animals and people at a particular site. But of course, that's embedded in a larger scale. It might be embedded in a larger protected area, and that in turn is embedded in a larger land or seascape. And those scales interact. The changes can generate at different scales, and they move up scale and cause changes at a larger scale. And of course, the larger landscape has a sort of a dampening or stabilising effect, and helps to dampen down the effects of any particular place in the landscape or particular event. Gets evened out over time, and where we see the sort of emergence of kind of broader patterns as the landscape kind of stabilises things. And of course, all of those scales are subject to drivers. Drivers are external sort of pushing forces acting on the system. Things like climate change, population change, changes in social attitudes or economic and trade influences, policy, as well as biophysical things like soil fertility might be a driver on the system. And of course, there's also shocks, which are shorter, sharper type events which impact on the system. So things like drought, fire, flooding, famine, conflict, disease, as well as things like price. A price shock, a change in a commodity price might suddenly see an influx of a particular crop type because it's productive, and or something like the price of ivory or rhino horn that drives a particular process on the ground, like poaching, as well as things like technology and innovation. So a new technology, a new type of agricultural technology, or the introduction of irrigation, or the building of a dam, or whatever it might be, can create a shock to the system. So resilience assessment has to think about the role of these types of events, as well as thinking about that scale issue, about what's the scale we're interested in and how is it influenced by the scales above and below. Also, a part of framing, the way we frame it, is that we see resilience assessment very strongly as a participatory approach. So people within the system, they understand the system best, and so we always try to engage and involve people in the system to the extent possible. So that means planning a participatory approach, thinking about who and how people are going to be involved. It's also an iterative process. You never get this right the first time round. This is not something that you can just do once and be really confident that you've got the right answer. That's just not the case. A resilience assessment is really always about being proximal. You're just getting an approximation of the system and your understanding at this point in time. And of course, because it is a complex system, it will change over time, and it'll change because of the things you do in the system, the interventions, that will change the relationships. And so you're always aware that your understanding is just temporary. You understand the system in its current configuration, but of course, as things change, that understanding gets more blurry. And finally, this is not a set recipe. There's no step-by-step detailed process. We'd always encourage you to think about adjusting the process for the context. So depending on the capacity that you've got available, the resources, the time, and right through to practical things like if it's in a monsoonal area or an area subject to cyclones or whatever it may be, disturbances, there may be periods of time when people can't participate in your sessions or in your participatory process. And so having to adjust and think about the system, planning around, crop harvest times or planting times or seasonal conditions, etc. So keep in mind that this is not a set recipe. And then finally, it is really important to think about ethics, things like power and gender in process design. So how are people being engaged? Is it fair? Is it transparent? Who's being privileged? Power is always part of the system, and so designing your process to take account of that, to think about how power might determine and dictate who gets involved or not in participatory processes is always important. So I would encourage you to think about those things before you start. So if we think about why might we do a resilience assessment, so in the box on the left here, so this usually starts with the recognition of some problem in the system. So someone identifies there's something going wrong in this system, there's something that they'd like to see changed, or there's a problem that they can see that exists or is emerging. And you have to have a goal, obviously, to take a resilience-based approach to management. There's lots of other management approaches out there that you could use. But in this case, someone's determined that you want to take a resilience-based approach. At the other end, you'd like to come out of the process with a resilience-based set of interventions, so a resilience-based approach to intervening in the system with the hope that that changes the dynamics and changes the trajectory of the system. And of course, in between that's where resilience assessment and implementation comes in. That's the bridge between these two kind of bookends, the objective or the goal to try and take a resilience approach and actually getting something to work on the ground is the role of the resilience assessment and implementation approach. I'd also stress that learning is part of the system as well and part of this approach, although we're not going to delve into that much in this session. So let's look at what's in that box in a bit more detail, that central box. Well, really the purpose of a resilience assessment is to identify, to implement and learn from a minimum set of interventions that influence critical dynamics in the system. And that's in order for the system to adapt or transform towards more desirable trajectories in the face of these known or unknown drivers and shocks. So there's quite a bit of detail there. We'll just delve into that a little bit more. So first of all, it's important to recognise the way we're framing this here, which is that we're talking about both the resilience assessment process, but also the implementation and the learning is all part of taking a resilience approach, and it's all part of a resilience assessment approach because, as I mentioned earlier, you can't get the detail right. You're always having to learn, and one of the best ways to learn is to start to do things in the system and learn from those. And so we consider that as part of the whole assessment process is the implementation and learning from that. This notion of a minimum set of interventions is really important. Resilience, one of the sort of rules within resilience is that the rule of hand, that there's really only 3 to 5 key dynamics, key variables that determine most of the dynamics of the system, and most of the effort should go into trying to identify that smaller, reduced set of key variables. And that's what a resilience approach is really designed to do and is good at doing, is to distill down what are those key dynamics. Distilling down produces a set of these key sort of locations to intervene in the system, and then the task is to identify some interventions that will address those key dynamics. And this idea of being able to adapt and transform towards more desirable trajectories, because we're focused on social ecological systems, because they're complex adaptive systems, they're never going to be fixed. So it's not as if you can go in and do an intervention and walk away and feel like that system is fixed or you've solved the problems. The system is always evolving, and it's always subject to new drivers, new shocks. And so really this is about thinking about how systems move along particular pathways, whether it's just adapting within a sort of known range within the current identity of the system, or whether it's transforming to something, a more radical kind of shift towards a new configuration. But it's always about systems moving through time, rather than thinking that we're going in to assess something, identify an intervention, implement that, and it's fixed. This is about saying, how do we build the capacity of a system to adapt and transform over time to those known and unknown drivers and shocks that might emerge in the future. So that's the purpose of a resilience assessment. So what does it look like in practice? Well, it's really a process of engaging with people within a particular system to develop sufficient understanding of that system to allow the identification of those key intervention points or leverage points, and then designing those actions to influence those leverage points. So it's engaging with people in the system to do that. In practice, that's done through just gathering lots of information from stakeholders and technical sources, so from technical reports and maps and data sets, etc., and from stakeholders, and organising and synthesising that information in a way that allows greater insight into how the system's structured and how it functions, and therefore where you can intervene in the system. So it is a process of gathering and organising lots of information and reducing that down and distilling out those key points. So the phases of a resilience assessment, as I said, this is not a set recipe. These are broad phases, and sometimes you'll be doing a number of these phases in parallel, or sometimes you have to iterate back around and come back to one of these because you realise you've moved through the phase and you've got to the next stage and you haven't got all the information you need, or you don't have the understanding that you need. But so broadly, 6 phases: a preparation phase, which is really about getting organised and determining particularly things like how are you going to engage, and as I mentioned before, with key reference to things like agency and power, gender, and ensuring that the process is fair and transparent and all the stakeholders in the system get a chance to participate, as well as planning out how to use resources, how to engage with people in the system, etc., and how to have a group that helps you to do that thinking and organising and distilling of information. So all of that's part of that preparation phase. Then there's a phase of describing the system, so really trying to identify the current system, how it works and its components. And I'll go into these in more detail in a minute. Then there's analysing system dynamics. So this is taking a deep dive into parts of the system and really looking at those dynamics and distilling out some key information. Then using that to design interventions, and as I mentioned, these are very strategic interventions that are aimed at particular parts of the system to try to produce or influence and change dynamics in a particular way. Then designing that implementation process, so designing it so that you can get the maximum benefit and learn from those implementation of those actions. And then obviously implementing it on ground and learning from the system. I'm not going to talk about all of these phases in detail. I'm just going to cover the ones with the asterisks there, and we'll touch on a little bit on the others, but we'll mostly go into detail around those 3 with the asterisks. So the first one, describing the system, and really this is asking the resilience of what? What do we want to make resilient? So the objective here is to develop a sufficient understanding, a conceptual model. In practice, it's a conceptual model of the basic structure and function of the system to allow for deeper analysis in the next phase. So this is really about taking stock about understanding the system and how it works. So it's things like identifying the boundaries. What are the edges of this system? Where are the boundaries of this system? And that can be quite a difficult question because systems are always very porous and linked to the scales above and below, and lots of things move and cross boundaries. So that's a real challenge, but it's an important part of setting up a resilience assessment is to define those boundaries, identify those scales, and then characterise the broader sort of things that determine this system: the climate, the ecosystems, the landscape, the natural disturbance regime. So for example, is it a floodplain system, or is this a savanna system that's subject to periodic fires that are important for keeping the structure of the vegetation open, for example? Then looking at land uses, starting to understand where people fit into the landscape. So what are the land uses? What are the relationships between people and landscape? What are the values? What's important to people living in that landscape? What are the benefits and goods and services that are generated by that landscape and from those ecosystems? And then how is that governed? What's the tenure system in place? So how is it organised? And how do people get access to resources and share those resources, etc. Then thinking about aspirations. So what do stakeholders in the system want the system to be like? And are their aspirations being met? And this is where you really start to define problems. This is where you start to understand what are the issues that people are dealing with in this landscape. And so it's that difference between, or the differential between what the landscape currently does and produces and how it functions, and what people would like it to do and function and produce. It's that difference between those two where issues are really start to be identified. So it might be that this landscape doesn't produce the number of wildlife that people would like to see in the landscape, and that might be, you might be able to trace that back to disease, or it might be related to the availability of water resources, or overgrazing by domestic stock, or whatever it might be. But it's the difference between what people would like to see in the landscape versus what they are seeing and able to access and use and benefit from. We then might look at drivers and trends and shocks that impact on those aspirations and those values and benefits. So what are the things that are impacting? What's driving? What are the shocks that might impact on people's ability to generate those benefits or well-being that they'd like to receive and manage the landscape for and with? And then all of that really helps to start to articulate these are the key issues in the context of those aspirations and drivers. You can really start to say, we're starting to see that in this landscape, these are the things that people are really concerned about. Here are the things that are driving the system and pushing it in a way that's seeing a reduction in some of the benefits or ecosystem services that people want out of the system. We can see what's driving those to not be produced. So this is the start of really honing in on the issues. Now there's more to describing the system, but this is just an overview, and there's a lot more detail in some of the guides that are around about all of the types of things. But broadly, this is the sort of information, the type of information that you'd want to understand through this first phase of a resilience assessment. So what are some of the sort of key practices and tools in this phase? Well, things like interviews and surveys and workshops with people. Interviews I've always found to be a really powerful tool, and I would prefer to sit down with a smaller number of people and really understand how they think about the landscape and get their understanding of how the landscape works, rather than try to engage with lots of people in a superficial way. Interviewing people is always a great way to get some depth of knowledge and understanding about the system. Of course, literature reviews, data trawls, all of that sort of stuff are important. A really powerful tool is historical timelines. They're a great way to engage people in thinking about dynamics and about how systems change over time. And they become a really important artifact out of the process. They document a lot of change, and people can recognise that their system has changed again and again over time, and what were those critical periods, and what were the drivers that caused those changes. And you can ask questions like, why wasn't the system able to cope at that time? Why couldn't people cope with that change? Or why did they cope with that change? Or why was that introduced species able to escape at that time and become a problem? Or why was that introduced species able to be controlled or managed, or whatever it might be? What are the effects of different types of infrastructure on the system? What happened when the railway line was closed down? What happens when the new dam was built, etc. You could also use tools like ecosystem service mapping. A really key tool is just drawing really basic social ecological diagrams and influence diagrams. They're just an incredibly powerful tool, really simple and easy to do, but incredibly important in starting to understand the relationships between people and the resources and the landscape and the natural ecosystems and the way they interact with those. The outputs from this process, really, you're trying to get an agreed conceptual model of the system with those issues identified. So to the extent possible, having as many people in the system agree with the understanding that you've put together, and being able to, for people to be able to recognise, yes, you have captured that understanding of the system, how it works, and what some of those key issues are. And I'll just give you some examples. So here's a simple social ecological system diagram. You can see on the left-hand side in the green there, it's got information about the external controls on the system, so the climate and regional biota, etc. Then it's got more detail about the social ecological system, the slow changing components and the fast changing components down below there. And on the right-hand side, it's got aspects of the social system about how they influence the system. Now, while that's might look very simplistic, it's actually incredibly powerful to start to recognise these relationships, recognise the interactions, which parts are internal, which parts are external, what parts are changing rapidly, what parts are changing slowly, and how are those interactions occurring. Those types of simple diagrams are incredibly powerful for helping people to start to understand how their system works. Here's just a really simple influence diagram. I won't go through it in detail, but this is for a grazing system where Indigenous people were also harvesting food, and so there's a whole range of interactions there, the different components of the system in blue. But importantly, there's in pink there's two really key events that happen: high intensity fires that really change the nature of the ecosystem there, and also overgrazing from domestic stock. And those two things combined create a whole range of disturbances, and they result in what was the key problem in this system down there in the bottom right in the green box, which is the reduced nutritional and cultural values of vegetation communities for the Indigenous communities. So that's a relatively simple diagram that was just developed through interviews and discussions and listening to conversations, but it captures a whole range of information and organises it in a way that people can understand. So just some simple tools like that as the first sort of outputs and starting to organise. But you can see how you can then start to hone in. So clearly here we need to understand in this diagram the dynamics of overgrazing events and how do they happen, why do overgrazing events happen, and how do high intensity fires happen, and how we might intervene on those if we want to change the outcomes in terms of nutritional and cultural values. So after doing a broad assessment of understanding and describing the system, you would go into looking at analysing system dynamics, so the resilience to what. So this is getting into much more detail now, doing that deep dive that I mentioned. So the objective here is really to identify intervention points to address key issues that reduce the adaptive or transformative capacity of the system in relation to those known and unknown drivers and shocks. And so this is really about trying to understand and get to that heart of what's going on, the underlying dynamics in the system. So you're building on a system description, but you're really focusing in on those issues within that description. So that's why it's important in that earlier phase, describing the system, to really hone in on those issues and put as much detail and information around those issues as possible. You really want to explore the dynamics of the issue within that systemic context. So you really are focusing in on just elements of the system now and drilling down deeper. And the aim is to identify those critical variables associated with thresholds and tipping points, as they are the points at which systems tend to move in unexpected directions, cause a change in the delivery of benefits and services or values that's often quite unexpected. It can be a surprise, and it can result in people not enjoying or losing the benefits fairly quickly from a system that they thought was functioning okay. And you also need to assess the general capacity to manage unknown drivers and shocks. So all of the above is really about focusing on knowns, but you also need to understand, can this system cope with unknown drivers and shocks? Has it got general capacity or general resilience to cope with those things? Because we won't always be able to anticipate what the shocks are or the drivers might be on the system, and there'll always be new ones evolving over time. So some really key practices here. This is one of the most challenging parts of a resilience assessment, but some really important tools, things like a 3x3 matrix that shows the scales, the different domains and thresholds, and the links between those is really important, and I'll give you an example in a second. And state and transition models for identifying how the thresholds, any thresholds of potential concern, how the dynamics of those. And these two tools are really important for starting to drill into those details. So this is a 3x3 matrix, we call it. So down the left-hand side, you can see it's got social, economic and biophysical. And then across the top, it's got farm, landscape, landscape to catchment, and state to nation. In those boxes there, numbered 1 to 10, are the different key thresholds identified for this particular area and the relationship between them. Now, each one of those boxes has information, detailed information behind it, but this is just starting to get an understanding of the relationship. So what happens if we cross a particular threshold in a particular place? What is it linked to? What other thresholds could it knock on to and cause a cascading effect through the whole system? And of course, things like shocks that are identified on the side there can cause those thresholds to be crossed if those shocks are severe enough. This is a little bit of an overwhelming diagram, but it's a state and transition model. It's a fairly simple way to capture a lot of information. So just for a start, concentrate on the 3 grey boxes across the middle. You'll see on the left-hand side, we've got a desired state. So that's what people in this system wanted the system to be like. On the right-hand side, there's the undesired state. So that's what people didn't want. So that was the degraded or fragmented system that they didn't want. And in the middle is a sort of transition state. It's where the system is sort of on the way to a more desired or on the way to a more undesired state, depending on the drivers. Sitting around this is lots of information. It identifies in the green box the major drivers that are pushing the system and the shocks. And then you'll see some red dashed lines there, and those are the thresholds. They were identified, the key tipping points that need to be managed in the system, and there were 3 that in this wetland and lake system that needed to be managed, and they were to do with managing the entrance of the lakes and allowing enough flow in and out, managing the infrastructure around to remove and redesign infrastructure that was stopping natural flows from and reducing flooding that was having a severe impact on biodiversity. And then looking at the final one there on the left-hand side, the tipping point is looking at economically viable income options for land managers that own land around the wetland to encourage more conservation practices. So 3 really important tipping points. And then you can see in the blue boxes there some major intervention points in the system. So these are points where if they were intervened at these points, they would have a major influence on the dynamics. And the dark blue box in the middle at the bottom there identifies key variables to manage. So things around planning and economic values of buffering vegetation and entrance, the management of the entrance to these particular lake systems and the community values. They were the key variables that need to be managed. And so from this, interventions can be designed that are targeting those key interventions, but it's all based around the knowledge that's extracted out of these types of models. So the outputs from this really is a really tightly defined set of critical dynamics and intervention points have been identified. So that essentially it's reduced down that complexity down to just a very small set of things, as I said, 3 to 5 key interventions. Cross-scale interactions have been identified and mapped, and then those key interventions have been identified because that's what we need to take forward into the next phase. And then finally, designing interventions, the sort of so what, now that you've been through the resilience of what to what, it's now asking so what. So the objective here is to design interventions and an implementation process, and it's important to stress that this is also about designing how you implement and those interventions, that builds knowledge, so by testing assumptions and strengthening the evidence base, and builds the capacity of people in the system to continue to adapt and transform in the future. So it's not just about designing a project and going off and implementing it. It's really thinking about how is these projects, how are they going to build capacity of people in the system, and how are we also going to learn the maximum amount we can. So this phase involves designing a really adaptive learning implementation approach, so getting away from the idea of just projects as sort of set and forget, but really engaging deeply and saying how are we going to learn from what we're doing on the ground. Developing and designing and filtering criteria, developing design and filtering criteria so that we can ensure that the interventions are really effective and efficient and they're achievable, so technically, socially and economically feasible, and that the system, that we minimise any unintended consequences so that we make sure that our interventions don't make anything in the system worse, or that we don't cause any unintended consequences. And we know that a lot of development and a lot of conservation interventions over the years have caused a lot of unintended consequences in the system. And so this is about being very aware of the potential for that. Just on that, using your systemic understanding, the knowledge that you've generated in that system description and system analysis can really help here in terms of identifying unintended consequences. So going back to those system diagrams and looking how things are connected, and then posing a lot of what if questions. What if we did this and we changed this relationship? What else does that affect in the system? What's connected? Then designing pilots and trials to test those innovations. So always doing that on a small scale first. So designing things in a very safe fail way, so that things don't get out of control, you don't cause those unintended consequences, and then you can test and scale those up and out. And so you need to design that scaling up and out process as well. So all of that is part of that designing the intervention process. And then designing the implementation to be safe fail, as I said, and bringing back in those issues of transparency, being ethical and fair. Who's going to get the benefits of some of those interventions, and is that fair? What if one group of people or stakeholders in the system appears to benefit more from the system interventions that you've designed than someone else? So making sure that stuff's fair. Again, I won't go into detail. This is another state and transition model, but out of this state and transition model, here's a summary table from that state and transition model that identifies the drivers, the threats, those key variables. What's the threshold that we're trying to address? And then you can see on the right-hand side there, the column, what are the actions that are most appropriate to prevent a system crossing the threshold? And so there's a list of particular interventions that were identified that are targeted at addressing those key intervention points to stop this system crossing a threshold. And so then the process would be to take those priority actions and embed them in an implementation plan that's really designed to do that learning that we mentioned before. So some really important points about designing interventions. You have to learn your way forward. In complex adaptive systems, there's no certainty and very little control. And so you're always trying to learn your way forward. Your conceptual models will invariably be wrong in some way. So some of your assumptions are incorrect, or the relationships you've missed, or you've over or understated some of the connections. And so you really, it's a hypothesis. The implementation is designed to test that hypothesis that you've developed about your understanding of the system. The only options to sort of learn by do and refine that conceptual understanding over time. And I'd encourage you to investigate triple loop learning. So you really need to drive some deeper reflective approaches to learning. So reflecting on the 3 Ps, not just on projects, did the project work or not? That doesn't tell us a lot, but what was the process for identifying things, and what was the purpose for the work we were doing? And reflecting on those deep levels will drive a lot more learning. Okay, so in summary, a resilience assessment, they've assessed the assessment approach has proven over a long period of time now to be really powerful for generating new insights. So I've been involved in hundreds of days of resilience workshops with people in various settings and contexts, and it almost always generates new insights. So people get some new perspective on the problems they're trying to solve. So even if they're old problems, they'll often generate new insights and help people to see new dimensions or new aspects of even well-known or problems that have been around for a long time. They're really powerful at identifying systemic intervention points, and we know that that's very different to often how interventions are designed, and there's lots of examples where using a resilience approach has identified very different intervention points than would be traditionally identified. They're really good for developing new connections and relationships, so doing the engagement and working with people to understand their system and their aspirations generates a lot of new relationships and new connections, and they're often really important in linking people up together in the system or across scales, which is really important for managing in the long term. And we know from survey work and follow-up work we've done that it does build capacity to manage systems. And so just engaging people in the system and managers in the system in doing this process, builds their capacity to manage the system. So there's lots of benefits for doing a resilience assessment, but there's some challenges too. Resilience assessments take time, it takes resources, and you know, this is not a simple, quick process. It does take time to engage, to design it properly and engage with people properly. It does require some facilitation and technical knowledge, usually bringing people together and working through it. It does require some skills to get the most benefit from the process. But again, starting small and building up, you can develop your own skills and bring that capacity in to help and support you if you need to. It's really worthwhile to go through the process. So that's all from me about resilience assessment. As I say, Alison Quinlan from the Resilience Alliance, she's one of the most experienced resilience practitioners in the world. She's a fantastic resource for you to draw on through those discussions, and so you'll be able to pick up issues that you haven't been able to we haven't been able to touch on in much detail here. Alison will be able to cover off on some of those. But also, here's my contact details, my email address. If you'd like to, by all means, feel free to email me any questions or any follow-up information you might like, and we can continue the conversation. So thanks for joining us, and good luck with the rest of the MOOC.